I think we're all ready. All right, so at the end of a week that started with International Women's Day, and as we mark the end of a particularly challenging year, a year that has often been heartbreaking and often inspiring as well, it's really an honor and a delight to welcome all of you to the fourth and final event in this year's Annie MacDonald Langstaff workshop series. Of course, I'm welcoming many of you also to Montreal, to McGill, to the Faculty of Law, and also to the Center of Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, which has been the co-sponsor this year of the Annie MacDonald Langstaff series. And I should also mention that this particular event in the series doubles as the annual Margot E. Halpenny lecture to honor the memory of one of our McGill alumni from the class of 1976. As many of you know, this year's workshops have all been organized under one theme: leading the change, the potential and power of women in law. And the series has been organized this year with two unique features. The first is the connection to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. The idea for the one theme over the year and the idea of using Zoom in order to go around the world to bring speakers to us this year came out of a conversation between Nandini Ramanujam, co-director of the Human Rights Center, and me last summer. And all of our speakers this year have been connected in some way to members of our Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. I want to actually stop briefly to thank Sharon Webb, who works with the Center for Human Rights, and Elise Mallette, a third-year law student, also connected to the center, who have been absolutely crucial to supporting the series and helping to organize over the year. The second unique feature is the significant participation of our women doctoral students, also coming from around the world, and leading the change, I would say, as remarkable young jurists. And today's workshop, we will have two of our doctoral students, Vala Gudmundsdottir from Iceland and Maya Ceballos from Colombia, who will be engaging in dialogue with our guest speakers and indeed introducing them formally. So I will not take that job on, except to say that I am just so delighted to know both of the deans who will be speaking with us today, and to share them, if you like, with all of you. For those of you who have been with us through the series this year, you'll know that we've had a Minister of Justice from Namibia, a Brazilian socioeconomic rights advocate, a senior equality rights lawyer from India. This time, of course, we turn to what I happen to think is probably the most important context for looking at change in law and justice, and that is legal education. And we have a special first few minutes, actually, to underscore the importance of that context, the context of legal education and university education more generally, because this event is also serving to launch the celebration of McGill's bicentennial. I'm going to turn to my colleague, Rosalie Duke here. You will have noticed that I have now mentioned and thanked a whole range of dynamic, wonderful leaders and women, even before we hear from our guest speakers, Dean Gillian Lester and Dean Camille Nelson. So I'm going to turn to my colleague, Rosalie Duke here, who's going to talk very briefly to us about this bicentennial celebration and about this Annie MacDonald Langstaff workshop as the launch event.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Shauna, for your generosity in letting me take a few minutes to speak at this beautiful event. In order to tie McGill's bicentennial celebrations into this Annie MacDonald Langstaff workshop. So on March 31st of this year, in a couple of weeks, McGill officially turns 200 years old. And while the pandemic has unfortunately forced the university to postpone most of its bicentennial celebrations to the 2021-22 academic year, we can't let the bicentennial month of March 2021 go by without any bicentennial event. And as the chair of the faculty's bicentennial committee, I have chosen this event as the inaugural one to highlight the celebration of McGill's milestone birthday, because the theme of this workshop, Leading the Change, the Power and Potential of Women in Law, gives us the opportunity not only to celebrate all the women that Shauna has mentioned, but especially two amazing women in law, Dean Gillian Lester and Dean Camille Nelson, but also to celebrate the courageous journey that women have taken in our law faculty and more generally in the legal profession. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit courageous myself. I'm going to be sharing my screen for a moment. If I can do that. Okay. To give you a sneak peek of our faculty's bicentennial project, which is entitled Leading in Law Across Time, à l'avant-garde du droit au fil du temps. And essentially it is a website where we divide the faculty's history, it's a little bit slow, but it's coming, into 10 unequal periods. And we highlight the key events of those periods and the faculty's evolution through these periods. So the first thing you can notice is that this is actually a photo of Annie MacDonald Langstaff, and she is the icon of the third period in our faculty, 1914 to 1938. In this period, of course, we highlight her unbelievable story, the first woman to graduate from McGill Law in 1914, denied entry to the legal profession. There's actually an amazing the Superior Court of Quebec judgment because she actually petitioned the court to be able to write the Quebec bar, but the judge said that no, it would be against a good public order and good morals to have a woman, let alone a married woman, be a member of the legal profession. Thus, she was never able to practice law, and women were not admitted to the Quebec bar until 1941. And she did receive posthumously entry into the Quebec bar in 2006. While we celebrate Annie MacDonald Langstaff, and she's sort of really the champion of women in law, we really can't forget the stories of other trailblazers. And our website tries to highlight some of those as well. I'm just going to tell the story of Florence Seymour Bell, who in 1920 was the second woman to graduate from McGill, but the first to practice law in Quebec, because she found a loophole, right? She used her legal education, so she learned about loopholes. She became a member of the Nova Scotia bar and used a reciprocity agreement to therefore be able to become a member of the Quebec bar, although she was still not allowed to plead before the courts. In addition to celebrating female students, our website also celebrates, obviously in a much later period, the period of 1968 to 1980, pioneering women professors. So our first full-time woman professor is actually Jane Glenn, pictured on your left, and she was hired in 1971. That's not that long ago. So I think we also want to pay tribute to not only pioneering women law students, but pioneering women law professors. And finally, I don't want to overstay my welcome because I recognize that I'm sort of barging in on your party, but I would like to just jump to the most recent period, which is 2008 to the present, because in our current period, we also highlight the presence of women and feminism in our faculty by highlighting some really incredible initiatives taken by today's female law students. I'm just going to point out two. The first is Contours. Contours, Voices of Women in Law, which is a student-led journal that focuses on amplifying women's voices in the faculty. And also this incredible initiative created in 2016 by two female law students, Law Needs Feminism Because, which essentially is a campaign where we take photos of people and they create a caption explaining why they believe law needs feminism today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, just to conclude by saying that our website also highlights how our women graduates have become deans of law schools, Supreme Court justices, Court of Appeal justices, influential politicians and jurists, and as have our two speakers today, who I can't wait to listen to. So thank you all again for giving me this little moment to plug our bicentennial celebration. I believe this lecture and this bicentennial is something we as women should celebrate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rosalie. And so now I will turn, as promised, to Vala and to Maya, who will introduce our guests.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Maria Ceballos, also called Maya. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dean Gillian Lester, current Dean of Law, and Lucy G. Moses, Professor of Law at Columbia University. I must confess that many times, as it often happens to Colombian students, I have introduced myself saying that I studied in Colombia. And people react by congratulating me for having studied at such a wonderful law school. So although unfortunately I am not a Columbia graduate, I can personally attest to the enthusiastic admiration that Columbia Law School arouses in the international community, particularly in the last few years with Dean Lester at the helm. Dean Lester was born and grew up in British Columbia and obtained her LLB from the University of Toronto. She later earned her JSD from Stanford University and began her legal academic career at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and later joined Berkeley's Faculty of Law, where she served as co-director of the Berkeley Center for Health, Economic, and Family Security. She has also held visiting appointments at Harvard Law School, Georgetown Law, the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, among other renowned law schools. She became the second female dean of Columbia Law School in 2015. Dean Lester is also a leading authority on employment law and policy. Her scholarship focuses on workplace intellectual property law, public finance policy, distributive justice, and the design of social insurance laws. She has written several and widely cited academic pieces on family security insurance, family leave, and age discrimination in labor law. So as you can see, we have a truly eminent guest with us today. Finally, I would like to welcome you all again to this conversation. Paraphrasing something that Dean Lester herself said in a convocation speech last year, I am sure this workshop will enhance the purpose that brought us all to legal education in the first place, because that purpose can never be quarantined. Vala, now you go ahead.
Thank you, Maya. It's so nice to see everyone here today. And so my name is Valgerdur Gudmundsdottir, but Vala for short, it's much easier. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. And I'm a DCL student at McGill University, and today it is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dean Nelson from the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa for this workshop series here today. And it is my responsibility to try and give you a brief overview of Dean Nelson's many achievements throughout her incredible career. I could talk all day and not cover all of them, but I'll try and do it in just a couple of minutes. Dean Nelson was born in Kingston, Jamaica, but moved to Canada and earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto, her LLB from the University of Ottawa, and her LLM from Columbia University. Prior to entering academia, Dean Nelson was a litigator at the McCarthy-Tétrault law firm, and in 1994, she became the first Black female law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada, clerking for Justice Frank Iacobucci. I hope I said it correctly. Dean Nelson has taught as a law professor at St. Louis University and Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. And she was also the first woman and first person of color to become dean and professor of law at Suffolk University, where she initiated the Law Practice Technology and Innovation Institute. Prior to moving to Hawaii, she served as dean of the American University Washington College of Law, and her achievements in leadership have repeatedly been recognized by various institutions. Dean Nelson has taught, for example, courses on contracts, criminal law, torts, critical race theory, comparative criminal law, transnational law, criminal procedure, and professional responsibility. Her impressive scholarship focuses on the intersection of critical race theory and cultural studies, with often an emphasis on health law, criminal law and procedure, and comparative law. She has published in many respected publications such as the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism, Berkeley Journal of Criminal Law, and the New York University Review of Law and Social Change. She has also served as the co-editor of the Journal of Legal Education of the Association of American Law Schools. And if that is not enough, she has also received numerous awards while serving on boards and foundations, the awards that recognize her achievements. She has, for example, been named among the top 35 women in higher education by Diverse Issues in Higher Education magazine, as well as being listed as one of the most influential people in legal education by the National Jurist magazine. Dean Nelson has also received the Paul Robeson Distinguished Alumni Award from the Black Law Students Association of Columbia Law in 2017. As I said before, it is my great honor to introduce you, Dean Nelson, to this workshop today. And me and my colleague Maya, we look forward to an insightful and productive conversation with you and Dean Lester, who I would also like to warmly welcome. And I just wanted to get things started. I wanted to explain some of the questions that, as Professor Van Praagh said, that some of them will be directed to both of you, whereas others will be directed to only one of you. But when that happens, the other one can please feel free to join in and add something to the conversation. So just to get things started, I thought I might start with a question that is meant for both of you. As me and Maya have stated, you have both led remarkable lives and have extremely distinguished academic careers, going from being law students to becoming deans of law faculties. You were also both, interestingly, originally non-US scholars currently holding leadership positions in US law faculties, which, as we understand it, is quite an exceptional accomplishment in the US context. So me and Maya, we wanted to ask, what significance do you think that a diverse background can have in these situations, and what can it bring to the table?
You want to go ahead, Gillian?
Go ahead. Well, I'll say a few things. You know, I think that it has been very important to my path that I came to the United States, and I came into my path into the academy as a Canadian who had seen a broader perspective on the world. Simply put, for law schools to lead the shape of a public conversation about so many things, but especially including in an increasingly global world, the issues of collective governance around critically important questions around sort of our shared legacy, the planet, the structure of international governance, and the dynamic around the changing and shifting institutions, and also, I guess I would just say a perspective that's less specifically country or oriented or nationally centric. Growing up in Canada, I remember very clearly feeling that the news cycle, the issues of the day, always had a very broad lens. And I think bringing that broad lens perspective, thinking about other countries, always thinking about what free and democratic societies what questions are they asking? What choices are they making? This is just fundamental in Section 1 of the Constitution and part of my legal upbringing. I think it shaped my way of looking at the world through a broad lens, and I believe that may have been at least some of the reason why I had something to add to the conversation when I came into the Academy in the United States.
Yeah, I absolutely think Gillian's right. I sometimes look back and, I'll be honest, we never intended to stay in the States. So one of the things that's curious, a couple decades later, is that we're still here. And I think for those of you who are, for law students, so much of this has been serpentine, and it's been a matter of sort of following passions and possibilities, and being able to sort of embrace uplift that I didn't always plan, to be totally honest. I think that growing up in Canada as an immigrant as well, one is often not just through one's personal life and sort of family life, but also through schooling, looking outwards. And I agree with Gillian. I think, in Canada, we often are naturally taking a comparative orientation to problems and possibilities and challenges of the day that no doubt serves us well in the States in terms of our leadership. So it's been interesting when, as you sort of reflect back on things, and now I often say I'm a double immigrant, and what does that mean? And I think in the present moment and what we've seen over the last several years, I think so much of my upbringing in Canada and the various experiences sort of come together, and you think, oh, that's why I went through that, or that's why that teaching or that opportunity or that lesson has served me well. But I do think having a diverse background only adds to one's ability to see more broadly, and to hopefully be a little bit more inclusive in one's thinking about, even SWOT analyses when you're thinking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and what that might mean. I think it's helpful in an American context to remind people that you don't always have to reinvent the wheel, that there are other places that are doing things really well, and other areas that we can learn a great deal from. And I think sometimes that seems so basic to us as Canadians, but it's not always the first way of thinking in some places in that I've been anyway. So I hope that serves my institutions well.
Thank you for this. And my only glimpse of Canada for 1 year pre-COVID, I can just say that following the conversations on the news, and it's such a diverse society, and you can definitely bring a different point of view. You had a question, Maya.
Sure. Thank you so much for your answers. And I think we will return to them later, probably at the end of the conversation. But now we want to ask you a question about gender equality. We have noticed that in many countries around the world, actually, now the majority of students, of law students, are female. The problem is that this is often not reflected or sort of represented in the gender balance of the faculty members and deans. So we were wondering if you can discuss a little bit like the current challenges that we as women still face when we aspire to academic leadership positions.
Sure. So I think the nomenclature of gender balance absolutely captures the fact that there is no gender balance yet. And it's very much a work in progress that takes determination, intentionality, and real leadership, at least as I've experienced it. The schools where I've had the pleasure to serve, you are absolutely right, Maya. There have been often more women in the entering class matriculating than people who would classify as men, for example. And the challenge as we see it is, as you go on in your legal career, whether that's into practice or into private practice or into some other type of practice, and certainly into leadership, the women tend to disappear. And certainly don't have, it doesn't seem, as many leadership opportunities in their respective institutions. I think there is a question of support, mentorship, sponsorship, and those might be the obvious answers. I'm increasingly tending to think as well that we have to encourage women to see themselves in areas where there are not many of us. And by that, I mean to say, I've been in most recently in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years in particular, encouraging women to think about where we are not and to move into those spaces. So at least when I was in law school, there was a lot of encouragement for me to think about, family law and criminal law to a lesser extent, but that was really because I think I'm Black, because of my race, not because of my gender. Immigration law, more public service oriented types of law. Think about going into government. There was very little encouragement of me, even though I have an administration degree undergrad, to think about corporate law, tax, securities, IP, like all of these spaces where you think about still are largely devoid of women's voices. And I've been increasingly thinking about what does diversity mean in those spaces, because frankly, there is a need to diversify, especially those more corporate areas, but also there's justice work to be done there, and there's change to be undertaken there, and there's a real potential to think about, social justice in another number of these areas where we don't necessarily conceptualize it as living. So I think we have to also just be more capacious in our opening up of possibilities for women to move into spaces where there is just an absolute dearth of our presence, let alone our voices.
Let me just add I just want to vigorously nod my head in response to Dean Nelson's comment about where we are not. And I too have been very consistent in searching for places where we are not. I'll just add that, as the Academy increasingly turns to people who have interdisciplinary training, a JD and a PhD, I've also been very stalwart in searching for women who are coming up through some of the more quantitative social sciences and technology as their interdisciplinary influences that they bring to the table, just to create that voice of authority that comes from being a quant. I don't mean to put that above other things among the kinds of areas that Dean Nelson was talking about, but I just wanted to say that really resonates with me. And I've also been working working in that dimension. Let me just offer a couple of additional comments. First of all, I just want to say I had actually a little bit of a hard time finding data about just how many deans in the United States are women, what percentage, but I think I believe this is just, and Dean Nelson may correct me on this, but I believe that it's somewhere between high 20s to 30%. In Canada, though, just doing a nose count and looking at the Canadian law schools, I was delighted by what I hope is an accurate count, which is that more than half of the deans of Canadian law schools are women. So I just wanted to just do a little, high five, just a little acknowledgement of that really important fact. I feel, I'll say a couple of things. First, I think every woman in the academy has experienced herself as somebody who is regularly selected to serve on committees that require a heavy lift. It's just, from the first, I was put on the appointments committee before I was tenured in my first academic job. I think it was my third year in teaching, and there I was on the appointments committee, which is notoriously one of the heaviest committees in terms of reading and just the basic kind of the labors of the faculty. And they're joyful labors, to be clear, but they are labors, and they're labors that need to be shared with all of the other responsibilities that you have as a growing academic. And so one of the things that I have found to be especially salutary is the recognition that I think is an overdue recognition of calling that leadership, of calling that leadership and saying, this is not housekeeping work. This is not background work. This is the work of leadership of faculties and those who've been doing a great deal of that kind of leadership, increasingly being recognized as those who are at the head of an institution is really an important recognition for that. I'll also say that I'm very, very conscious in my role as a woman leader in the legal academy of all the shoulders I stand on. When I came into teaching, the dean of the law school I first joined as an assistant professor was a woman, Susan Praagh, and she was a pioneering woman dean. I come to Columbia as the second woman dean behind Barbara Black, who pioneered that in the 1980s, and that surely has made the path easier for me as a dean, that these other women on the vanguard, faced the blank stares at a time when it was just so much rarer to see women in these roles of leadership. And so I always think to myself that I hope that these shoulders are in turn shoulders on which others will stand, and I carry that feeling of responsibility with me as a dean, and it informs the work I do. So I think it's important for just to see it from that dimension of a chain of inspiration, if you will, and I'm the beneficiary of that.
Can I piggyback on something that Dean Lester said, which is when we find ourselves privileged to be in these roles, I think we often do take very seriously those sort of burdens or responsibilities to make sure that the door through which we entered is not immediately closed after we've departed, right? And I think, it is very much a part of my mindset that I'm trying to keep the door open and hopefully broaden it and maybe you knock the door down, right? Like to make sure that we continue to have diversity and inclusive leadership, whatever that means, with all of our myriad intersecting, identities. because it very much is the case that I think, especially when you're the representational first, or you're in these roles, people don't just see you as the dean of, it's like the dean of is a woman, or the dean of is a person of color, or the first out gay, you know, you get the identity attached, and that does add another dynamic to your administration. So I am quite aware of the fact that I don't want to be the first and the last, right? So you try to make sure that you're simultaneously leading with integrity and building structures and programs and avenues for further inclusion, and at the same time, you know, hopefully diversifying your leadership structures, et cetera, et cetera. So even if you're not in the space anymore, the space will be welcome and one of belonging for other people to pass through into the enterprise.
Mm-hmm. No, I just want to say that everything you mentioned is very thought-provoking, but I find particularly interesting that you both talked about the importance of encouraging women to think about where we are not. And I just keep thinking that requires, of course, identifying and understanding those places and areas where we are not. And we definitely, like inside and outside legal education, have to take that task more seriously. Vala, maybe you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, I'll take the next question. Also, thank you so much for your answers. It's incredibly, there's a lot to learn from for us. I have a question for Dean Nelson. You've written a lot about race in various contexts, such as policing and mental health, as well as having taught critical race theory. In a couple of your articles, you have discussed how these issues often intertwine and can sometimes create complex situations. I think probably most of us here agree that knowledge of these issues is something that is highly relevant everywhere in the world. And I was wondering, what place do you think courses such as critical race theory, critical feminist theory, or even mental health law, which in a lot of law faculties are only elective courses, what place do they have in modern legal education?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I want to just step to the side a second to let you know, if I'm glitchy at all, I apologize because it is torrential here right now. So I just want you to know that if there's something, I will fix it and be back if it's at all glitchy. I think that in addition to the seminars and the upper year course offerings, we have to think more intentionally as a faculty often about how we decolonize the curriculum, right? And make sure that whether it's anti-racism pedagogy is informing the substance and actually the delivery of our curricula. And we have to think about that in terms of feminism as well. Obviously, there are myriad faculty governance issues in terms of academic freedom and the imperative of a faculty member to develop their own syllabus. But I think increasingly the moment demands a real deep review of how we are doing what we do and what we are sharing as core. Now, I recognize there are licensing dictates and all sorts of externalities that push into the way and what we deliver in terms of a legal education. But I think we are doing a disservice to our students if we don't also think very seriously about the type of knowledge, at least awareness of subject matter and whether that's critical race theory or the ability to speak around race and rights and identity variables is not, I think, esoteric. I mean, I think the world is changing. The demographics of both of these countries are changing, and the world is smaller. I think we've seen not just a national racial reckoning. I think it's been international, as I like to remind people down here. I mean, look what's gone on in England, looks what's gone on, it's all over, right? I mean, most countries, I'm speaking later about a matter to deal with race, and I was looking at the cities around the world where there were protests following the killing of George Floyd. And it is a remarkable map, right? So these conversations are not niche conversations, right? They're conversations that inform so much of what is core to what lawyers do and what legal academia is called to do, especially if we are serious about change and social justice. So, you know, when I teach contracts even, I mean, there are questions of social justice in contracts. There are questions of social justice in professional ethics. There are questions of social justice in torts, not just criminal law, which people hopefully understand. There's lots of talk around about, you know, race, gender, sexual orientation, sexuality. I mean, but there are these conversations to be had in many, many areas of our curriculum. The question is whether our faculty feel comfortable enough to talk about them, and frankly, will do more good than harm in some of the ways that we address them. So that's why I do think there has to be some faculty ability to do this well. So there's also a question of how do we support and train our faculty? Because our students, I'll just be honest, at the last few schools I've been at, our students really want, and in many cases need, to at least be aware of this changing world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this insightful answer. Is there anything you would like to add, Dean Lester, or should I switch back to Maya?
You know, I thought that was such a thoughtful answer, and I really just want to affirm that we are in a dynamic moment in which we're shifting the conversation about what the core is, and I think it's really important. I like the framing of it. What is our core? So beyond that, I'm happy to move on, but I appreciate the comments of Dean Nelson.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question goes to Dean Lester. I'm interested in one of the books you edited, the book called Employment Law Stories. The book talks about some landmark cases in employment law with some sort of behind the scenes stories and descriptions of how the actors in the legal field interacted or interact in each case. We would like to know, why do you think it's important to teach law in the language of experience, and to make students aware of the intricate stories behind the stories that we usually learn in law school?
Thank you for the question, which I think is so intriguing in the sense that we don't always think of ourselves as storytellers, but I really believe that part of what we seek to do as teachers, as leaders, and also as lawyers is to capture the human experience in a way that will be vivid and that will allow people to have empathy for the lived experience of others. And storytelling is one of the most, if not the most powerful way to do that. Let me give you an example. Let's take the experience of what it means to be poor in our world today. Many people know, more people than I wish, know what that's like from their own lived experiences. But many others, in particular those who have influence and the power to help bring about change, they don't have a frame of reference that's more visceral, that strikes at their emotion and empathy. And so how do we help them understand? We can humanize by telling stories. And a good example of this is a book written by a journalist named Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickeled and Dimed. and she basically lived the life. She sort of went in to an actual lifestyle of a socioeconomically disadvantaged American worker. She worked in low wage, minimum wage, low wage jobs. And she then told the story of her experience of working in that part of the economy in a painful and excruciating detail. And I used that book in some of my teaching so that our students could read those stories and experience them. But it was also a book that was for a period of time was a bestseller. So strategies like this are compelling, and they can change people's minds. And in my own writing, I've learned from that. And I write about employment law, and I write about social insurance. So essentially the systems governed by government to spread the risk that ordinary people face of finding themselves out of work or ill, or having somehow disrupted lives. And I found that stories can be really helpful in connecting with an audience that's broader than just fellow academics. And one of my favorite articles the articles that I enjoyed writing the most was about how conservatives and libertarians may be opposed to the idea of expanding social programs, but maybe they could get behind that with a framework from their own belief systems. And instead of just making the argument in a kind of dry law professor way, I used the example of a fellow who was very much in the popular parlance at the time I wrote the article, a guy nicknamed within the American press, Joe the Plumber. And he was a person who said we need to get we need to get government out of my Medicare. We need to get government out of these programs that that in the end he was a beneficiary of, a recipient of, and it was a way of showing his own lack of awareness about the extent to which social insurance programs actually benefited him, but he was working with a framework that showed a lack of awareness and understanding of that. And that telling that story created an easy and accessible way into a sensibility that everybody might not understand. But I also think those law students in the room and others who've studied trial practice also are well familiar with the power of storytelling as for trial lawyers and advocates. You're speaking to a group of human people, a jury, even the judges, and the power of being able to frame something in a story that people can connect to, where they imagine that an ordinary human is involved, is profound. So thanks for asking the question. It's something that it's worth all of our thinking about, how we can. And I just want to connect it back to Dean Nelson's last comment about how we recenter the core of our curriculum. And I think that using stories, using narrative, having people tell others about their experiences is a way of building empathy and understanding in a space where those who may have the most influence over the design of curricula, for example, and the choices they make, may not have had the experience of being in the minority in the classroom, or being in a classroom where you feel imposter syndrome, or you feel that stereotype threat that makes you panic before an exam. And what is that? What's the lived experience of that? How can we tell stories that help people to understand that?
Okay, thank you so much. I was already convinced about the importance of storytelling, but your answer was already so compelling. I don't know if Dean Nelson would like to add something to that answer.
Sure. So the series, the Law Stories series, I don't know if that's specifically what you're talking about, but there are these wonderful supplementary books that share the stories behind the cases. And I've taken, to the extent I, have been able to teach in the last few years, but even just when students come to office hours, especially, to be honest, students of color who are trying to find themselves in the pages of the case books, we've often sat, or I've said, do you know, this story actually had, Black women in there, and a family in such and such. And just to really humanize some of the ways that we sometimes forget when we are eye-racking or dissecting and doing our legal analysis of a case. What's the holding? What's the rule? What's the dicta? I mean, and back and forth, to make sure we understand that these are people. We're sort of real people who were suffering or who were going through something. And the job of an attorney and a lawyer is to serve a client. And for many of those students, and for me as a professor, it's been helpful to learn more about what brought the matter to the court in many cases, or how this matter evolved and the journeys of the people involved. So it's supplemental in most cases in terms of how we approach the pedagogy and the syllabus. But at least for many of the students of color who have come to me and basically complained about what was going on in the classroom, to the extent I could share with them or talk to them about, what was going on beyond the pages and connect that to their lives, or to make sure I could share with them that they weren't crazy for thinking something else was going on in the case, it's been helpful. It's been helpful. So.
Okay, thank you. I think this is actually one of the strongest and probably most fascinating conclusions of this series of workshops, the immense power of storytelling in legal education and even in the legal profession more generally. Vala, I don't know if you want to go ahead with the next question.
Yep. I have a question for Dean Lester. You are an internationally recognized authority in employment law, and we were wondering, how has that expertise come into play in your work as dean? Have you reimagined employment area spaces in since you are now in a position that you can at least partly have an effect on this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that what you might be thinking about is sort of nuts and bolts, and absolutely that's true. So I'm very attentive to issues of inequality in the workplace. I'm very attentive to issues of fairness. I'm very attentive to the ways in which people may feel it's very challenging for them to come forward and speak to something that's happened in their working day. So these are things that I teach about, but I also feel I want to take it sort of to 10,000 feet. I also feel that work is central to people's identity. It's work is a form of human activity that we spend a great deal of our time with, and it shapes our interactions with the rest of the world in really important ways. It shapes our status in the world in really important ways. It shapes our life plan and our projects and our sense of contribution. And depending on how the workplace is structured, that can either be extraordinarily empowering, positive experience, an experience of human flourishing that's been enabled, or it can be an oppressive experience, an experience of exploitation, an experience of reinforcement of inequality. And so I think that the workplace and workplace law is a wonderful laboratory or microcosm through which to think about very, very big ideas about the structure of human relationships and the structure of society and its governance. And so I think all the time about these big themes. I write, one of the things that themes in my writing has been around social solidarity. You know, I was talking earlier about that article about Joe the plumber and how people come together to create social support and be willing to pay taxes for social insurance programs. You know, what are the nodes of creating solidarity that can move people together to be other regarding? How does that happen? And, you know, you can think about it if you've taken a labor law class. You know, one model is collective bargaining and organized labor. I've thought about other models outside collective bargaining, outside organized labor. What are the things that one can do? How can politicians, how can law reformers create legal structures that bring people together around common interests and enable them to move forward in support of that kind of other regarding, sort of pro-distributional kinds of programs that can protect us all. So I also think that when I come into the role of being a leader in an organization, I bring those lessons to bear as well. How can you have people pulling in the same direction? How can you build a community of people in a workplace who feel like they have a sense of common mission, a sense of common purpose, even though they may be radically different across a whole range of dimensions in their experiences, in their commitments, in their ideology. So I actually find it to have been an intriguing and totally privileged opportunity to take some of the lessons from my work and see where I was sort of onto something and see where I was actually a little naive, and just take those lessons and be more reflective as a leader as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this. It's so interesting to study how we, as academics or individuals, sort of bring forth our experiences and what we have learned, and how you put it back into your work. And would you like to add anything, Dean Nelson?
No, that's great. I very much appreciate Dean Lester's answer.
Okay.
Okay, so now I have a question for Dean Nelson. I am currently conducting research on gender inequalities in the Colombian judiciary, and I have also been assisting Professor Van Praagh in her research about Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci. And I know that you clerked for him, and I would like to know in which ways do you think your experience as clerk and clerking for Justice Iacobucci in particular, sort of like how was it important for your academic career? And more generally, what do you think that legal education can learn from the judicial field?
Sure. So as Shauna knows, Professor Van Praagh knows, I'm a big fan of Justice Iacobucci's on a professional and a personal level. I think that clerkship changed my life. And it was one of those opportunities that allowed for further opportunities. And I think at the time, I had no idea how catalytic that year would be for me professionally. And it's not as if at that time in my early 20s, I was thinking about legal academia or deaning. I don't even think I knew what a dean did, right? I mean, it's anything in my horizon to think this far out even, right? I mean, sometimes when you're in your 20s, you're not thinking about your 50s, right? You're not planning, 3 decades forward. But when I look back, I realize that so many of the opportunities that I've had, especially as a Black woman, have been seeded by the lessons learned and frankly by that year, especially in the academy, as people are sort of looking through your resumes and looking for a clerkship often, et cetera, et cetera. There were a couple things that happened with that possibility, with that opportunity. I thought it was a secretarial position initially. And I've told this story before. I applied just ahead of the deadline. And I applied because my vice dean called me because she saw that I had not applied. Vice Dean Sandra Rogers, who I am indebted to eternally, because at that time, I think the dean's office ranked the applications coming from a given school. And I had done well in my first year, and I was a strong student, thank goodness. I was fortunate to be. And she called me and she said, "Why didn't you apply for this?" And I said, my mom's a secretary, and I was really hoping that, and I've worked in like as an administrative assistant before, but I was hoping after law school to, use my law degree. And so I didn't apply. It's like I had no idea what it was. And and I didn't know any lawyers before I came to law school, et cetera, et cetera. So I had no idea what this was. And she very patiently, without any arrogance or, sadness, she could have been like, "Oh, poor pitiful girl," right? Mm-hmm. She explained to me what it was and why I should apply, and the sort of relevance of, how the rankings, even those, I remember getting the ranking in the mail, when they ranked the first year class, I didn't even know I was going to be ranked. And so, she explained this to me, and, I was interviewed by a number of judges after I applied, and I really hit it off in my interview with Justice Iacobucci. And it's interesting because going into the application process, I thought, would I work for Justice Corey or Madam Justice Laura DeBay? And, what was this going to be look like? And I really hit it off with him, and I am eternally grateful that he hired me. And he's been wonderful, as Shauna knows, at keeping in touch with his clerks and his grand clerks, as he calls our kids. I mean, so it's just been a tremendous experience. I think that sometimes translating that experience in the American context has been sort of fascinating. I've been asked, is that the highest court in Canada, right? So sometimes people actually don't know that the Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court of Canada. And so just sort of making sure, or just answering questions has proven interesting. But the other thing I will say, and this is where we also have to support each other and make sure that as women and people of color, we are sort of helping each other to take risks or to further our own career trajectories, and not sort of getting in each other's ways. I remember taking some flack from some of my colleagues who thought that by accepting that position, I was going to diminish my street cred. And I remember being like, they're like, if you go and clerk for the Supreme Court of Canada, that's going to undermine your street cred. I was like, what are you talking about? But there was this whole conversation I remember having with some of my fellow students and about whether I should take it. And as I look back on that and I think about my own kids and I think about my students, I mean, I think my life would have been different. Hopefully I would have done okay, but I don't think I would have had the opportunities academically, certainly, that I've had I, for some reason, thought my street cred, in quotes, whatever that means, right, would have been diminished by taking this opportunity. So I'm a big fan of clerkships. I continue to tout clerkships to our students at all levels. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity.
Okay, great story. I find very interesting that the story about the vice dean telling you to apply is also connected to what you both mentioned earlier about the importance of keeping the doors open for those of you, like those who come behind you, right? I don't know if Dean Lester would like to say something about the relationship between the judiciary, the clerkships, and legal education or the legal profession.
I have nothing to add to this part of the conversation. Just really interesting to hear Dean Nelson.
I just want to say one thing about Justice Iacobucci that I think a lot of judges also bring to bear. He very much conceptualized his role as an educator of his clerks. And of course, he, was a faculty member before at U of T and I served in various ranks at the University of Toronto. And so he very, very much undertook a sort of pedagogical approach to our writings and, our bench memos and, debriefing with us after a hearing. And that those were important opportunities to learn as well, in a fashion that was similar to what we experienced in law school, but elevated, right? And I greatly appreciate the fact that a number of judges and justices like him take very seriously the further education of their clerks, which is another reason why I'm very bullish on clerkships.
I will add just a little bit to that last point and amplify it. I think that clerkships, so let me back up 2 steps. I've been very committed in my time as dean at Columbia to explicitly teaching leadership in the law school. So business schools have been teaching leadership for time immemorial, and law graduates have been called into leadership roles from time immemorial. But somehow those dots have not been connected. And so I'm really been excited to be part of a growing movement around in law schools. I certainly know across the United States, and I'm confident Canada's probably still a step ahead on this in teaching leadership very explicitly. And so now let me connect the dots to clerkships. I believe that the opportunity to work in a judge's chambers, to see how literally, not just that law gets interpreted, but really how law gets made, to see how judges, when the word adjudicate is such a packed word, but how judges listen to people's concerns, how judges wrestle with with issues of justice, how judges wrestle with issues of interpretation, and how the judges also work very hard to create a public legitimacy of the role of the judiciary as a branch of government. I think that the leadership opportunities inherent in that are extraordinary, and the insight that one gets into public leadership are extraordinary through clerkships. And so one of the initiatives that we have at Columbia Law School that I'm really excited about is building a pipeline program within the law school to encourage students who might not otherwise even know what a clerkship is when they arrive at law school, who maybe haven't been sitting around the dinner table with their parents and learning about their parents' experience when they were clerks. People for whom that's just a really obscure concept when they arrive at law school, saying from the beginning in first year, this is an opportunity that's available to you. This is an opportunity for leadership. And what can we do to begin talking with you, somebody who might not otherwise have imagined yourself to be the sort of person who would become a clerk, to be a clerk. So first generation students, women, minorities, people who really just don't have that aspiration because they don't know that it's an aspiration to have. So that's, I think, an important aspect of creating the next generation of leaders that, that amplify different kinds of experiences.
Thank you so much for adding that to the conversation. Professor Van Praagh, do you think we have time for one final question, or should we open the floor to questions from the audience?
I think that maybe we'll open the floor, and maybe what we'll do is watch the time, and if we can come back to you for one final question as in the kind of concluding part, that would be great. So I have just been so delighted listening to this back and forth and thinking about, well, it's very interesting to listen to both of you talk about storytelling and actually think back to my time as a doctoral student at Columbia and the paper I wrote for a legal education seminar that was all about storytelling in legal education, and about, I think it was interesting also, about how when we're in our 20s, we don't think about being in our 50s. But the challenge, of course, for those in our 50s is to think back, not necessarily just to our own trajectories and how we felt in our 20s, but to really listen with care to those who are now in their 20s, and to include, both think of our role as teachers in telling stories, sharing stories, but also incorporating new stories as they come along, and fostering this sense of solidarity that also came up. And I think also, I'll just pick up on this last point about teaching leadership. We're teaching tomorrow's teachers. They may not all become academics in law faculties, but they will all become teachers in some way, and supporters of others, and consciously working through that is a challenge, but also I think particularly in positions of leadership, a real privilege and honor. So I'll open it up. If I will watch the participants list and look for hands, and I see one already, and I will also go back to the chat. I know that there was a question that was written on the chat, and we'll come back to that. So I'll turn over to Darren Rosenblum, who will be joining the Faculty of Law at McGill this coming September. So Darren.
Thank you, Shauna, and thank you to both deans for joining us today. It was a really super interesting conversation. You both commented on the diversity question, and I'm a big admirer of both of you in terms of your work on diversity. Dean Lester and I were in a room together last summer about thinking about incorporating race perspectives in contracts. One of the things that I've been encountering is trying to get my colleagues who are not necessarily focused on these questions to think about it in the ways that you've articulated it, in the sense that it is a key skill for lawyers to be able to have difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And I was just wondering whether either of you have come up with techniques to bring faculty who may be reticent to think of themselves as bearing responsibility in this area, to sort of bring them along. I know that's a sort of challenging question, but if anyone could answer it, it's the two of you.
So I'll try. That's the nut that's really hard to crack, insofar as I think our roles in that space are really around advocacy and persuasion and incentivization in terms of providing additional tools and support for faculty who want to engage in these conversations. And I do take seriously the fact that not everybody feels comfortable themselves engaging in these conversations. And then, I don't want to sort of inflict trauma or traumatize anybody by forcing people to have conversations that they themselves are perhaps personally struggling with, and feel they will, sort of put themselves in a situation from which they can't extract themselves. And when I was in DC, we did have, with the university support, some sort of curated conversations, right? Difficult conversations. I can't remember if it was called challenging conversations or controversial. I can't remember what the nomenclature, but there were university series, and I quickly piggybacked on top of it. The challenge is it's voluntary always, right? So, one of the things we try to do is think about who are the speakers that we bring in, the sponsored speakers. And of course, faculty often are highly respectful of other faculty, especially from, frankly, fancy schools, right? And so trying to think about sort of that art of persuasion through peer-to-peer conversations that can be facilitated in spaces where perhaps the students either are not or are only there for a part of the time, or there's retreats. But I think at so many levels in terms of the faculty conversations, it's persuasion and bringing in, at least where I've been, additional supports for faculty. there are also, frankly, real student demands in these areas. And to the extent we have to really take seriously what students are asking for, it pushes faculty to understand that, you know, from just sheer consumerism, but also what is our calling as faculty, we have to figure it out, right? So even if it's like not every single contracts professor or not every single criminal law professors, are we offering opportunities within the clusters of doctrinal and clinical teaching that the students are going to leave after 3 or 4 years if they're full or part-time with some competencies that are increasingly called for by our professional organizations? And how do we make sure that happens? One way that I found some, I don't even want to call it success, but some space is through the career development and professional development sort of parallel track to think about offerings, again, that are voluntary, but many students can then opt into those sort of threads of discussion and threads of enhancement through that adjacent development avenue.
And
Let me just add a little bit to this. I know there may be other questions, and so I want to create more space for other questions as well, but I do have some thoughts that I can quickly add. So just a couple of points. First of all, just agreeing with Dean Nelson on what she has said about the challenges of the need to, you know, people need to come to drink the water, and so you need a space where people feel like they want to be there. They're working hard. They've got an open heart. They've got an open mind, and yet, you know, you can find yourself in the seminar that you created, and I've been in some of these. You know, let's have a brown bag lunch, and the people who show up are the people who've all been doing a lot of hard work for a long time already, and you know, they're sharing with each other things that are advanced principles, and those who might stand to gain from learning are, you know, had something else going on that day. So one of the things that I've tried to do, working with members of my faculty who've been among the most committed to this kind of learning, has been, for example, to bring people into the fold to lead sessions or to be on committees or working who aren't kind of among the clearly identified members of the faculty who've taken these on as core issues that they've sought to lead and guide. So I might choose a member of the faculty who's, you know, maybe one of the more senior members of the faculty, maybe a person who's not necessarily seen as on the vanguard of introducing concepts of diversity into the classroom. And I go to see that person personally, and I say, you know, I'm hoping that you can serve on this committee, and I hope that you can lead a session on it. And that might be a hard thing for that person initially. I don't know anything about that. And it's like, well, you know, I think that if you though are leading that, it will bring other people on the faculty who think they don't know anything about that, and then they see you're doing it. Well, that may lower their barrier to coming to that luncheon. It may make them see that, you know, somebody who has their experience is making the effort and doing that work. So that kind of non-usual suspect modeling. I think the other thing that I'll just comment on very quickly is, you know, there's a moment we're in where forms of activism and social change are drawing on methods that, you know, can be more or less effective depending on the audience. And so there's a moment where this kind of time's up, had enough, calling out that has been in many ways really very effective as public advocacy. But for some people who you're trying to bring along, it can be terrifying, and they just want to hide from the risk and the possibility that they'll come to a session, they'll say something it'll be the wrong thing, it'll land wrong, and somebody will say, gotcha, that's an example of the wrong kind of behavior. So, I've found it challenging to navigate that, because I respect both the effectiveness of sort of calling things for what they are rather than not speaking up, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to allow people to feel like they can come to a project where they are going to stumble and they'll get it wrong, and they'll and they need to feel at some level of safety for having taken the risk of coming and trying to learn.
Thank you for those really frank and helpful answers. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to, I know there was a kind of comment and question that was written by one of our participants, Richard Mitchell, earlier. So I'll kind of put that. I think it was specifically to Dean Nelson, asking about, I think, the role and responsibility of taking on leadership within local, national, and international Black communities in responding to actions that constitute or are perceived as attacks on one's identity, and perhaps you can talk about that both as in this particular role as a law dean, but I think the question was kind of more generally thinking of yourself as a leader.
Yeah, over the last several years, it's been more of what I believe people expect of me. And, it's sort of interesting because I think many deans have been thrust into this moment where people are expecting statements. For example, Gillian knows there are conversations percolating about when do people speak, when do leaders speak, and you've seen a flurry of corporate statements on this moment, this racial moment, the moment of racial reckoning, especially after the killing of George Floyd and those, the ensuing conversations or not, right? There's been a call for. And it's interesting because I think especially I've felt, and I'll be honest, a number of us who are Black women deans and Black deans in particular in the States have sort of had side conversations with each other. And part of what's been hard for many of us is also like, we're reeling, we are hurting, we are knocked to the side and in pain and sad and depressed and angry and enraged and furious and disappointed and despairing and fearful for ourselves and our kids and our communities. At the same moment that people are like, where's your statement? Where's your statement? Your statement is like, we need it and we need it. It's been like 3 minutes, you don't have a statement out, and that kind of thing. And I think at the same time that the school has to be run. So it's fascinating in a way that there is this thirst for voice, whether or not, and I'm not sure, I hope it makes a difference, but I also think it's this lack of alignment, even when you're a person who feels deeply about whatever is happening in the public sphere and you yourself are punctured by it. I think there is an expectation that you're going to speak immediately to it, but there's no concession to the fact that you yourself might need support. And that, I'm not looking for sympathy or anything, but I think we have very little empathy. And so there's a duality in the leadership, you want to share something, but you want to also make sure, how are my kids? How's my family? Is my dad okay? Is my community, is my neighbor all right? Right? What's going on in the personal sphere, at the same moment that you understand that increasingly there is an expectation, despite the pandemic, despite the racial reckoning, despite an incredibly polarizing election cycle in the States, that people expect you to be somehow more on the fore. And I think there are identity intersections to that, right? So I've seen in the last 10 years of deaning that expectation and that portfolio, especially as a woman of color, has been
more of what I am getting from my own internal community, but also externally, right? So wherever, like whether I was in Boston, whether I was in DC, whether I'm in Hawaii, there is a clamoring for, even if it's not my subject matter expertise, right? It's a race matching, or it's a gender matching, right? So and I understand that's human nature. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's something that I think is a part and parcel of what we're expected to do. And I don't know if we're all equally versed and able to do it, especially given the toll some of this takes and over the cumulative toll. So it's interesting being, we're all humans, right? So it's interesting trying to think about how we navigate those expectations.
Thank you. I don't know, Dean Lester, if you want to add something about both the statements, but also what Dean Nelson was just talking about, that need for empathy and support. And then I will turn back to Maya and Vala to thank both of you.
Well, I want to say, really, before I talk about empathy and support, I just want to thank Dean Nelson for sharing those experiences that she's had of being torn between sort of the personal and the professional, and her responsibilities in both of those domains. And I think that's just very powerful, and I can't add to it except to say that I appreciate the sharing of it. And I think that some of my, I think that on the question of the role of empathy and support, I think in some ways they're of a piece with some of the themes that we've talked about earlier in the session. It's actually remarkable as I think about this session, we just kind of step back, and if I reflect later this afternoon or on the weekend about today's time together, and the theme being two deans who are women and who bring a different experience to the table, without wanting to stumble into essentialism about what we bring to the table. I think it's noteworthy how much our themes have centered around how we can bring a recognition of experience, a recognition of different lived experiences, a way of enabling people to come into leadership with a broad lens and a way of understanding and seeing our students in new ways, seeing our faculty in ways, helping our faculty to be able to understand in new ways. I mean, it just feels like it's been a theme in almost every question that's been asked in our answers. And I just want to comment on that as a striking, I think, an important observation.
Thank you. So as promised, I will turn back to our wonderful doctoral students, Maya and Vala, for a more formal thank you to both of our guests. But I have found this session just inspiring and insightful. And we were reminded by Rosalie Duke here at the beginning about these two initiatives taken by law students at McGill. Law needs feminism perhaps because we find leaders like these ones that we've been listening to, and also a journal called Contours, Voices of Women in Law, which will include actually in this year's volume an essay about the workshop series this year, including this fourth and final one. So Maya and Vala.
Thank you, Professor Van Praagh, for those closing remarks. I guess I just want to say that your work and careers are so inspiring that we would have loved to ask you questions for the rest of the day. We had lots of questions on the list, Vala knows, or for the weekend even. But unfortunately, we don't have that option, of course. But your answers were so insightful that I think we have more than enough material to keep reflecting on the possibilities and challenges of legal education and the legal profession. So it was an absolute honor to have you with us. So thank you again for joining us today.
Well, I'll just thank you as well, Vala, Maya, Professor Van Praagh, and my co-panelist, Dean Nelson. It's just been a tremendous pleasure, and I also want to thank the audience for engaging questions and just a really rewarding session.
And I want to echo that. Thank you so. This was such an enriching conversation. And I will say, I am not a morning person, so there are few things that would have me get up at 4 something in the morning. But an invitation from all of you was that inspiration. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I appreciate it.
Okay, Vala, you're muted.
Sorry. I just also wanted to thank everyone, and especially the speakers, and for all your insightful comments and all the knowledge that you have told us here today. I think there's a lot for everyone to take home and work through this. And for me personally, afternoons like this remind us of the importance of getting together when we can't actually be together. And I look forward to hopefully next year or the near future when we can actually be in the same room and have more conversations.
Wonderful. So thank you to everyone, whether it's early in the morning, late in the afternoon, even in the evening. We hope that some of what or most of what was said in this conversation will resonate for you for the rest of the day and in days and projects, life projects to come. So thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Good to see you all.
Seeing you all. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks.